Conversations on Effective Conservation with Luis Ortiz-Catedral. Introduction.
You are listening to the first audio of the session that we had with Luis Ortiz-Catedral in Gonaresu National Park, Zimbabwe, on September of 2023. Luis is a conservation biologist from Mexico who has done most of his career in New Zealand and Australia and Galapagos. I think Luis is a good example of someone who was originally trained as a researcher, as a scientist, as an ecologist, and little by little we can see his transition from, let's say, an academic profile to becoming a team leader in conservation. This first audio kind of follows his beginning since he was a kid in Mexico until he ended up doing a PhD in New Zealand focused on the translocation of parakeets. Most of Luis' career has been focused on translocation of endangered species on islands, compared to other practitioners that are going to be listening to who have worked mostly in big pieces of land, large parks. Luis has worked mostly on small islands and very specific species. This first audio, I think, is kind of a warm-up. Probably the most interesting audio is audio 3, where he provides practical advice based on his experience. But it's a good way to see his origins and to understand where does he come from before he gives us his advice. So now you're going to start listening to the edited version of what he gave us in an interview. And then we will move later to audio 2.
My name, as you know, is Luis Ortiz-Catedral, and I was born in Mexico in 1977, in the western part of Mexico, which is a kind of very dry landscape. And from an early age, I had an opportunity to go outdoors with my father hunting. And I think it was when I was around 6 or 7 that I realized that really made me happy. And I always had pets, so I really enjoyed animals and the outdoors. So when it came time, when you are young and people start asking you, what do you want to do when you grow up and all that, my answer would be a vet, an exotic animals vet, or some sort of captive breeding hybrid sort of thing. When it came to deciding what career to choose, for university, I originally started with a biotechnology degree. So I had this idea that by understanding principles of science and applying them to different biological processes, maybe I could contribute something to, the world and well-being for everyone. But very soon I realized that what I'm really good at is to network with people and to create little teams. I guess I would be if there was a group activity at university, I would be the guy who would be, oh, no, let's work like this. And, I can take charge and we can all contribute with ideas. And I felt very comfortable with that from an early age.
You felt that kind of calling before even choosing the formal studies?
I think so. Yeah, because I remember that even for school productions, I would be the one putting my hand up and, I wasn't afraid of taking charge. But there is a big difference between that and becoming a leader in conservation. I think it's a never-ending process. It's not a qualification. You'll never get a paper that says, now you're a leader and you are complete. But rather, you evolve according to new challenges and opportunities. And so from the moment I realized that I like working in teams, I thought that maybe a degree in biology would be better suited. So I switched degrees. And I went to university at the Universidad de Guadalajara in Western Mexico. And it was my calling. A lot of the courses were field-based. We'd have field trips to identify plants and animals and all of that. And as you can imagine, there was a need for someone to, take the initiative to help others with, homework or reports or whatever. And I really enjoy that. So I think that's how the ground was prepared for me to enter into this field.
So you study biology, and at that time, you saw yourself like field ecologists doing research, or you already were thinking about conservation and, I don't know, creating change in the world and saving species and things like that? Or because there are two very different things.
Two different things.
And, and if it's the second thing, why you want, I mean, where did you get that from? Because you don't get that from going to the field with your dad. I mean, with that, you get the love for nature.
That's right.
One thing is wanting to be a researcher, and another thing is, I want to be a missionary and I'm going to save the planet and all that.
Right.
Where did that come from?
So originally I was interested in ecology. That was one of the papers that I really enjoyed. And the relationship between animals and their environment was, was a very powerful calling. But my university at the time didn't have a strong sort of ecology degree. So I actually opted for botany. Because I think another aspect about myself is that I tend to be very pragmatic. So my reasoning was, once I get a degree, then I can specialize after. So maybe ecology will come after. For now, I just need the biology degree. So I actually became...
It was the same with me.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's like, I need a degree. This is boring, but I'm going to get the degree, and then I'll do something with it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I actually enjoyed it a lot. So I finished with a degree in biology with a specialization in botany. And then at the earliest opportunity, I took a volunteer position in a research, what is called Reserva de la Biosfera, which is like a biosphere reserve research institute in Western Mexico, working with lilac-crowned Amazons. This is a type of parrot there. And the scientist who was running this program, I guess that was my first taste of conservation, because illegal poaching of this particular parrot is quite prevalent in Western Mexico. But in this biosphere reserve, the nests were protected. And there was a whole program trying to understand why they were not a species that could be harvested sustainably. So I think that's when the wheels started to turn, that actually you can combine the elements of biology, botany, ecology to answer a more complex problem, which has to do with conservation. After that volunteering, in fact, towards the end of that, which was only a few months, I applied for a scholarship to study overseas. I wanted to go abroad and learn another language and live in a different culture. And I obtained a scholarship to go to New Zealand to study a master's degree in ecology. So my basic education in biology with my undergrad was the starting point for then a master's degree. And I was also very comfortable in academic circles. Like, I was a bit of a bookworm.
Okay. Why did you go to New Zealand?
So I remember,
instead of other country.
I think I knew about New Zealand from a very early age, and I knew about the different adaptations of the birds in New Zealand occupying niches that in other places would be taken by mammals. And I was just curious. And the catalyst was, this is the early days of internet. So I remember typing letters and sending letters by snail mail. So this is a long time ago. But my supervisor for my master's degree replied very enthusiastically, a very, very good email. And essentially she said, if you come here, we can start a project on this particular species on an island, and we're going to give you all the support that we can. So that it was hard to turn down that option. So I went to New Zealand in 2004. And it was a bit of a cultural shock, because obviously my written English was a little bit better than my spoken English. And so getting used to processing information in another language was the first kind of challenge. And then in that sort of degree, I had to produce a thesis, and my research topic was the reproductive biology of kakariki. It's a type of parakeet. And it wasn't easy, but it was a good challenge to get up to. And it was still, all of this was still ecology focused. I wanted to understand relationships between organisms and the environment. But in studying this organism, I realized that translocations between islands in New Zealand was a very common practice. You know, people would take, this has been going on since the 70s. In fact, the species that I studied is one of the very first, if not the first, conservation translocation that ever happened for a parrot species. A group of birds were moved to an offshore island. They multiplied. I arrived many years after to study them. And then I thought, oh, maybe I can actually use this species as a model for a PhD in conservation biology. It gets more interesting afterwards. This is just the boring, who I am and my story, but, we'll get to the cool parts in a bit. So it was actually during my PhD.
And if you want to show images, we'll do it whatever you want.
Okay, we'll get to that in a moment, but, because then I think that was the starting point of what later became a very steep learning curve. So for my PhD, I thought...
What do you mean by steep? You went from zero and you had to go...
Yeah, you had to go from zero to hero because there's people relying on you and you cannot afford to, slow learn. You have to just go for it.
And your biology degree didn't teach you much of that?
No, it was less about academics and more about, just trying new things and showing your true colors, I guess.
Oh, okay.
The impulsive orange. So the research question I wanted to answer was, what happens when we use captive bred parrots versus wild caught parrots and release them on a new island? Which ones survive better? And if that information can help us refine conservation practice, not just for that species, but for all of the different closely related species. This is a genus of about 9 to 13 species, depending on who you ask. It sounds simple, right? Except that one of the study sites was an island with people living in there. So we had to approach. There were about 200 residents. And every single one of them liked the idea, except for one. And that single individual started making things very, very difficult. It was a personal vendetta against the whole project. So I have chosen 3 sites, one island where people live, 200 residents, one fenced sanctuary, pretty much the way this camp is fenced to prevent predators to enter, and an offshore island, a very small island with no predators whatsoever. So there were all layers of academic sort of structure to test effects and all of that. But this particular individual on the island inhabited by people, he was not liked by the community. He built his own helicopter pad on his property, very, very wealthy. He's made his money selling toilet paper, I believe. And his complaint, the email he sent to the highest environmental authority in New Zealand, the Department of Conservation, was, I do not want these birds shitting on my roof, polluting my water supply. As if all the other birds already on the island weren't going to the roof. And anyway, but it was obvious that he had very strong opinions and he was going to make it very difficult for us to advance. He threatened with taking the Department of Conservation and the Auckland Council to court if they approve this project. And remember, I'm still a young student. I was 27 at the time. And for me, it was hard to process this information because the moment someone mentions legal proceedings, I'm like, I'm from Mexico, so I have a funny kind of feeling whenever anything about immigration comes up. And then, again, using this very pragmatic kind of approach, I thought, you know what? Let's cut that site. That's fine. We'll just focus on 2 sites where there is not an annoying, powerful individual, and that's it.
So the original plan was 3 sites.
3 sites.
Let's go for what is possible, and we'll see what happens later.
And then we got to 2.
Good.
But that's just the tip of an iceberg with a lot of challenges. And another thing that we knew from the get-go that would hamper the process, remember, no one had attempted a translocation of so many birds of this particular species at once. We were talking about 150 birds collected, from a wild population. It was a huge sort of logistical process. One thing that we knew was if there was a reinvasion of predators to either of the 2 sites, that will stop the whole thing. And the third kind of challenge, so one was stakeholder dramas, predators, and the third was a virus that is known as the beak and feather disease virus. Well, guess what? The three things happen. Even though we cut the sites and only kept two, rats made it to the shores of one of the study sites, and that triggered a whole response from DOC, the Department of Conservation. And we had to go through the hoops of figuring out what to do. Luckily, it was controlled and the animals taken out of the island, the rats. But then in the process of collecting birds for the very first release and sending the samples for testing, we detected beak and feather disease virus. And that was a big sort of shock because previous tests in a few months prior had not detected this virus. So it was almost like, oh shit, we had assumed there's nothing here and now this thing. And I guess I don't want to make it sound like it was always me making the decisions and leading all of this. I had a support network. My supervisors were great on that. And they helped me be pragmatic as well about, what next. So again, from 3 sites to 2, and now we have predators and this virus. And this is only in my first year of the PhD. So, yeah.
Who are you? I mean, because you talk about us, and we.
Right.
I mean, you were at university doing management?
Yes.
Or, I mean, like an NGO? Or...
So here's the team. So I was a student at Massey University, and the team, at least in paper, was my supervisor, who couldn't be in the field with me, but was on call all the time, Professor Diane Brunton. And I also had a team of 30 volunteers, friends, colleagues, different ages, different nationalities, 30 people on an island, who need to be fed. They need to catch the birds, process them according to a protocol that we developed. And that group of people also involved park rangers from the Department of Conservation, who were there on call should anything go south. So lots of people relying on things going well. And I guess ultimately, without being appointed, I had to take decisions. And my stress levels from being, a kind of young student with the first project started going up very quickly because we had an incident with one of our volunteers having the start of a heart attack on an offshore island. So then we had to take him out of the island and respond. And on top of that, we had the birds to take care. So, it's a high kind of a stress situation. But I'm going to abridge now the whole story just so we can move along.
To see what you learned at that phase.
The lessons that we learned. In the end, the project went ahead. The birds were released. Within 8 months, we had chicks on the island. And the other side was a mainland site. First time that the species was successfully transferred to a mainland site. I remember getting bullied by text because some of the birds died in the process, which is sometimes unavoidable in management of wildlife. And some people will send, I didn't know these people, some anonymous voices will send like, oh, you should stop this, and how dare you, kill this precious bird, when in fact it was just part of the process. But what I learned is that you really need to grow a thick skin, because the only way I could manage that was ignoring it and not getting into a rabbit hole of, why are people not liking me and why are they attacking me, and just trying to, get ahead. But here is the lesson that I learned on top of growing a thick skin. Within 8 months, when we sent the press release that the birds are breeding, this is a success and everything, everybody forgot the dramas. Everybody. Suddenly, in the front page of the newspaper, there was a person of authority from the Department of Conservation who wasn't happy about the project, saying, this is an example of how we do things in this country, success. And I remember feeling like, you know what, I don't need direct acknowledgement. I don't need them to say, you were behind this, because the outcome was what mattered. And I've kept those 2 lessons to this day. People have very short memories. And one of the recommendations that I will make later is that you need to make peace with failure. The project overall was a success, but there were lots of failures along the way. Remember, a stakeholder that wasn't happy threatening legal action, that's major. A virus that was not documented and that no one knew was in these birds was there. And a reinvasion of predators that could threaten their breeding success. Following the pragmatic approach, I decided to investigate the virus. So my thesis went from translocation management to what the hell is this virus, and is it really a threat to New Zealand parrots? So And I'm smiling because I remember that I felt very alone when the results came back and we were told those birds are no good, they have this disease. And after a few conversations with vets, we realized, well, we actually don't know what it causes on the birds. We are assuming is detrimental to their health. So within a few months, I took the initiative to put together a team of scientists, among them a South African who was the authority on viruses. He gave me a call and said, I heard your birds have this virus. I would love to sequence their genome. Can we work together? And I'm like, of course, absolutely. That is, to this day, my most widely cited paper. So, I didn't envision that. But when you associate with people that actually see an opportunity instead of just blaming or pointing at what you're doing, good things happen. So that's what I meant with that zero to hero, So that's kind of in a nutshell my first 6 years in New Zealand. Some of the volunteers were feeling responsible for something that wasn't their responsibility and making sure that they realized they were being looked after was very important. Another thing that I did, and in a way I carried on to this day, treat them well. Never underestimate the value of good food in the field. It's one of the very few comforts you'll have at the end of a very long day. Sometimes you just have to adapt to budgets, but trust me, a good meal at the end of a hard day and a good rest, next day you are energized again. So remember, this was part of my PhD, my one chance to create an academic foundation for my career. I wanted to be a lecturer. And I remember having this very conversation with my supervisor, who's amazing, by the way. She was very supportive. And I remember telling her, you know what? I don't think I'm going to reach any significant results, but what we're doing is meaningful. We have populations of this bird. That is real. We're actually doing something that people in the 90s tried and failed. We're actually making it happen. This is real. This means something, even though it's not going to pass those funny statistical tests or whatever. So that difference, that's another note that I wrote down for you. Always remember and reflect on the difference between significance and meaningfulness of what you do. Because in conservation, very often you will not have the tools or the opportunities to produce something with a high level of significance in the statistical sense.